Today's reading comes to us from Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 35. That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles away from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all those things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation you are holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here in these days?" And he said to him, "What things?" And they said to Jesus, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet and mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things have happened. Moreover, some women in our company amazed us. They went to the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find the body, they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels, who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But him they did not see." And he said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart, is it hard to believe all that the prophets have spoken? Was it not necessary that Christ should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted them in the scriptures, the things considering himself. So they drew near to the village at which they were going. He acted as if he was going further. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. And their eyes were open, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened us to the scriptures?" And then they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 of those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. May God bless his holy word in our understanding of it. Think back to 2004 if you can. A late autumn evening. The Red Sox are up 3-0. 2 on, 1 out. 2 outs, 1 on. The closing pitcher for the Red Sox has 2 of the 3 outs needed to finish the game. He pitches to the batter, who hits a ground ball right back to him. He underhands the ball to the first baseman, and the Red Sox have won the first World Series since 1918, 86 years earlier. I won't ask how many of you remember the time in 1918, but for me, this was the first time I had seen them win. And what great feelings for those of us who really loved the Red Sox had. Feelings of excitement and jubilation and some vindication and being a part of history. Then when the team came home, there was a big parade in Boston, and the festivities and the joy filled the streets and the Charles River, for that matter. It was the talk for weeks afterwards. Some believed the curse was broken. Some thought they would never live to see this happen. The excitement died down, and people were left with the question of, now what? Red Sox Nation has been a proud group of people who are used to staying in the suffering. We won. How are we supposed to act now? Maybe sports isn't your thing. Maybe it's reading a series of books or watching the last episode of a TV series that you really liked. Think back to it being over. The ending was satisfactory, but it was still an ending. You still had to face life afterwards. Many times we hold on to the hope that there'll be just one more book, or maybe a spin-off with some of the same characters, so that way we really don't have to say goodbye. Of course, these feelings aren't reserved for things that entertain us. We have to face endings in our lives. Endings like finishing school or retiring, and the seemingly final endings of someone we love dying. We deal with these events, and in some cases, by figuring out what is next. Sometimes through our grieving, and sometimes just relying on God. However, for most of us, there is a point in the times that we are really struggling that we stop and wonder, what now? Where has God gone? This is what has happened to two of Jesus' followers after they found out that Jesus' body was missing from the tomb. They had been prepared to follow Jesus. They had given up their lives from before they met him. They had seen their future as being with Jesus for many years to come. They are now lost. They expected a different outcome. They expected to be with Jesus. Now they're walking on a road and talking. We aren't really told what they're talking about except for the events that had just happened. But I think it's easy for us to imagine that they might have been talking about what now? Where has God gone? They might be heading back to their former lives, back to where they came from. Maybe they were trying to figure out how to start their profession of fishing or whatever it was that they did before. Maybe they were trying to figure out how to tell their family and friends that they had turned their backs on to follow Jesus, that Jesus was gone. These two followers have a long walk. It's over 7 miles from Jerusalem to the village Emmaus. These two have had a real long day, filled with many disappointments for them. They believe that their hope in Jesus had failed, that fate rather than destiny was controlling them. How often do we feel like this even today, even with all of our faith? Do you have times when you feel like God has abandoned you, or maybe even forsaken you? When we're going through tough times over and over again, do you start to feel like maybe this is your lot in life? Maybe fate is winning over the destiny that was promised to us all by Jesus. If we can think of these times in our lives when we have felt alone and maybe felt unworthy of God, maybe we can start to understand how these two disciples of Jesus were feeling. Not only had Jesus died, but his body was missing. There was no trace of Jesus. They were alone. They backed the wrong man. We are told that as they are discussing all of that happened, while they were trying to make sense out of all that they've seen and heard, that they must have been stunned in disbelief. It's this stun in disbelief that we do feel ourselves from time to time, especially when there's something so horrific that even when we're watching it, we can't believe that it is happening. How many of us didn't believe it when we watched the two towers fall on 9/11, or when we saw the blasts a year ago at the Boston Marathon? We could see the proof captured on film, and many of us still had trouble believing. Imagine how hard it would be to hear that Jesus' body was gone. Even after seeing the empty tomb, there must have been much doubt over the events that had happened. I know I've spent a long time on these feelings of grief and loss that these two travelers must have felt, and that we all feel from time to time. But I think it's important for us to know how lost and hurt they must have been, or the rest of the story wouldn't be as important. At some time during the journey, a stranger caught up with them. He asked what they were talking about. The two men said they were talking about the events that had transpired over the weekend. They told the man the story about Jesus dying and the tomb being empty, that they themselves went and looked into the tomb, and they could not find the risen Christ, even after the angels had said he was alive. The man whom we know to be Jesus tells the disciples that they are foolish and slow of heart to believe the prophets. In other words, as I mentioned above, the two men felt like fate had won and that destiny has gone by the wayside. But even then, they didn't know that it was Jesus with them. How many times are we not able to see God with us in our grief? Like the two men walking on the road, we focus on the pain we have from things not turning out quite how we had planned. We feel defeated, and it is hard to remember the promises of God. We turn inward instead of outward. We concentrate on the darkness moving in around us instead of cultivating the light that is burning in the darkness. We often miss God as God is walking beside us. So where was the light in these two men's darkness? If we look at this passage, Jesus was walking on after the men reached their destination. But the two men invited him to stay with them. But we're told that they more than just invited. They urged the stranger strongly to stay with them as night was coming. Even in their grief, even in their feelings of all being lost, they were able to think about the stranger's well-being, this person whom they thought they had never met before. They insisted that he come in and rest and refresh himself. How many times do we stand at crossroads when we're concerned about the horizontal journey that we're taking? We're concerned about what lies before us and after us on this line. And then many times, without our knowing it, the vertical presence of God comes in. It might not be a case like this when Jesus literally appears to you and enters the conversation. But the potential is there many times to see God at work in the human heart of the person next to you. During 9/11 in the aftermath, how many people put aside their pain to tend to others? How could firemen continue to climb floor after floor to try to save others, knowing that they probably would not be coming out? What gave people the strength to work all day, go to a funeral in the evening, and then stay all night looking for the remains of the victims? Same thing is true after the bombing in the Boston Marathon. What gave the people the fortitude to run towards the blasts instead of away? How did runners who had just run 25 plus miles continue running to hospitals and donate blood? I would suggest that it's because God can be found in the human heart. We just need to look for God there. I would also suggest that in our darkest hours is when we can shine our light the brightest. These are examples of events that were caused by humans and show some of the darkest places that humans can create. However, the light of God is found there, and it is much stronger than the darkness. We as people of God help, sometimes even when we need help ourselves. We as people of God stand up and say to others that they are not alone, even when we are feeling alone ourselves. When we are able to commune with each other, that is when Jesus is revealed to us. Just like Jesus revealed himself to the two men as they were communing with a stranger. As we heard today, when they were at the table, Jesus broke the bread and gave it to the two men. Then they recognized him for who he was, and Jesus vanished. The two men realized that on the road, when they were lamenting and feeling awful about Jesus not being with him, that Jesus was with them all along. They just couldn't see through their pain. It wasn't until they were able to put aside their pain and worry about someone else that they were able to see Jesus. Cynthia Jarvis writes that when we realize that God enters a conversation that we think we are having with one another, we cannot but find our lost selves standing still. I think back to many times in my life when I thought I had a clear understanding of what was going on, only to have it flipped on its head. This has happened to me many times, but most recently during my job as a chaplain at Beverly Hospital. I went into a room where there was a young man who was mentally challenged. I will call him Mark. Mark was for the most part nonverbal. I always pause and internally feel awkward. I feel that I might be pushing my beliefs on somebody. And worse yet, on somebody who can't tell me if they are okay with it or not. There was a worker in the room who said that Mark did like prayers. I put my hand on his and said a prayer for him. There didn't seem to be much of a response, which only fueled my inner struggle, my feelings of awkwardness, and my feelings of not being good enough for God. I prayed silently for God's guidance, and as I was starting to lift my hand off of his, he took my hand tightly, and with his other hand, he slowly traced up and down the scar on my wrist from when it was broken. After a few minutes of tracing the scar, he brought it to his mouth and gave it one of the gentlest kisses I have ever received. Instantly, the awkwardness, the inner struggle, the feelings of being alone in the room stopped. They were still. For that moment, they were gone. My eyes were open to the gift of God's grace through someone that I was uncomfortable around. This man who has had so many difficulties in his life was able to give me love and compassion and gave me the feeling of being cared for. While no words were exchanged, I knew that he wanted me to know that I was loved and he had compassion for me. This happened in today's passage from Luke. Jesus didn't come in and just fix everything. He didn't show the men that they were wrong. Rather, he joined with them. Jesus walked with them in their pain, in their doubt. It was okay to sit with them in their pain. Just like my time with Mark, he didn't kiss me or try to heal me right away. Rather, he held my hand and joined in with the pain that I had. That was the time he spent tracing my scar. He looked at it and touched it, getting to know it, studying it, being fully present with it and me. Mark then showed his empathy for me having the scar. He didn't try to take it away from me, rather he just joined with me. Here I was, the person that was supposed to be there for Mark, and I was the one being tended to. God's grace was given to me. My eyes were open. I was taken out of the darkness that I was in during the first part of my visit with Mark. God's grace was communicated to me through someone who didn't speak louder than 1,000 people telling me it all at once. I thought that one conversation was being held when in reality it was something completely different. And I found my lost self, the part of me that was feeling awkward, standing still. I was not the person trying to show someone God. Rather, I was seeing God through someone else. This is also what happened to the two men when they invited Jesus to dine with them. Their darkness was taken away. They thought one thing was going on, but in reality, something completely different was happening. There was also something else that was happening in both my encounter and the encounter of these two following Jesus. There was an invitation for God to join us, an invitation for God to join them. For me, it was my awkward inner prayer that I prayed, hoping to find a way to make things better, or at least not make things worse. For the two disciples, it was inviting Jesus in for the meal. Again, quoting Cynthia Javis, his love is such that we are always free to turn our back upon him, close the doors of our hearts against him, bolt our minds shut in fear of what inviting him in might involve. While Jesus could make a grand and glorious entrance like he does at other times, here an invitation had to be issued. These men, ourselves, need to take the first step. It is important for us in our prayers when we are suffering and feeling like all is lost to invite God to be with us. This is the first best step to knowing that we are not alone. As we head into our communion time here with each other and with Christ, we need to remember that the invitation is not just for us to join Christ at the Lord's table, but we're also inviting Christ to be with us.